Joining us this morning is the former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs under President Bush and Harvard Kennedy School professor Nicholas Burns. Ambassador, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maria.
A lot of news this morning overshadowing the meeting with Lavrov. Obviously, the president has fired Jim Comey, the FBI director. Your reaction ahead of this meeting with Lavrov today?
Well, the Russians are our most dangerous adversary in the world, and as Secretary Tillerson said, we have a terrible relationship right now. We have a crisis over Ukraine, so the United States needs to maintain sanctions. We have a crisis over Syria, where the Russians are using their air power to kill civilians. And now we have a crisis over the issue of Russian interference in our elections. And I think this is a difficult meeting for President Trump. It's his first meeting with a Russian leader since the president has taken office. And now that he's fired the FBI director, he's being charged with abuse of power. I agree with that assessment. And so he's going to have to, President Trump, he's going to have to raise this issue with Lavrov of Russian interference in our election. Any president, Republican or Democrat, would do that aggressively with the Russians, warn them not to interfere in our elections. And any president, I think, Maria, would have already launched his own investigation, but President Trump has done none of that. So I think there's a lot of pressure on him this morning. Very unfortunate timing for the White House that the Russian foreign minister, very experienced leader, cynical leader, is showing up in the Oval Office.
Ambassador Kirsten Haglund here. I'm wondering, the stage looks different, a lot different now than it did during the election. You had elections in France where Macron won. Le Pen was much more of the pro-Russia candidate. Obviously, you had those strikes in Syria, which didn't set up a great relationship with the United States and Russia. And as well, Putin is very vulnerable in Russia itself. So do we have more leverage coming into this meeting with Lavrov than perhaps we would have just 6 months ago with how much the world stage has changed?
Well, normally I think we would have leverage, but, the Russians, President Trump, has failed to criticize Russia publicly for any of these issues that we're talking about. He hasn't criticized Russia on Ukraine. He has not criticized them on Syria. And most importantly for Americans, he hasn't criticized them on interference in our elections. So ordinarily you'd say that the United States, because of the Macron election, because Angela Merkel looks to be returned in her September elections in Germany, normally you'd say the United States has the advantage. But right now, President Trump, unfortunately, has put himself at a disadvantage. And this is a real problem for the United States because traditionally American presidents, as you know, have stood up to the Russians, have been leaders of the West, and we're in the unfortunate position right now where most people think the leader of the West is Angela Merkel.
Well, wait,
because
Rex
she does stand
stood up to them, though, right? Rex Tillerson stood up. We just heard from Rex Tillerson talking about the relations at a low. He did confront these issues, though, right?
I agree with you in that. I think Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis, they've spoken truth to power. They've been very frank about our differences with the Russians. We haven't heard that from President Trump. Here's an opportunity for the president to do that. I think that's the test this morning.
But Ambassador Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State and General Mattis as the Secretary of Defense, they represent President Trump. And in terms of pushing back against Russia, look no further than that airstrike in Syria on that air base. That alone spoke volumes about what we will and will not tolerate out of Bashar al-Assad's regime and Russia.
Well, in any system of government, the leader's most important, and it is striking that the American leader is not talking the same way his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense done. That's a real critical difference, and what really matters in our system is, of course, what the President of the United States said. I hope the President will warn the Russians on Syria, because, as you know, they've been bombing civilian targets, civilian towns and cities in Idlib province in northern Syria, as well as, of course, in Aleppo. Some European leaders want to take the Russians up on war crimes charges for what the Russians have done in Syria.
Ambassador Burns, there's been a lot of focus on the Russian interference or potential interference in the U.S. election. There has not been as much discussion, and I want to get your comment on, there was the document dump in the last moments of the French election. There's been a lot of fake news worries in the German election. All of the Eastern European elections seem to have some degree of online hacking types of interference. I mean, is there a larger pattern of Russian interference in the democratic process all around the world, and when does that become elevated on the Trump agenda?
And for years. This just didn't start last year.
Right, it didn't. It's just taken on a broader meaning now because the French believe that the Russians did interfere with the Macron campaign. Chancellor Merkel and her government believe that Russia's already interfering in elections that won't take place until September. And of course, our intelligence community has said that Russia did interfere. So there's a broad pattern here. And the United States is the leader of the West. We're the most powerful country. So this is an issue that President Trump should take up in his very first meeting with a Russian leader since taking office. That's this morning.
Yeah,
I think that's why the president needs to step up to this challenge.
We'll see if the issue comes up. You make a really good point. Now, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice joined us on the program yesterday. She weighed in on how the administration should handle Russia. Listen to this. I want to get your reaction, Ambassador.
There isn't much room for cooperation with Russia, but there is some. And I think that what you saw with Secretary Tillerson when he was in Moscow a little while ago was a willingness to be pretty tough with the Russians and to say to them on the Syrian chemical weapons deal, for instance, you were either incompetent or you weren't telling the truth. And so that kind of straight talk with the Russians will actually gain a measure of respect with Vladimir Putin, who is somebody who admires strength.
So, again, it's been the president's team, Rex Tillerson included, to have set things, set this tone with Russia. But you want the president to be more adamant about it.
Well, Maria, I do. I think he leads our government. He speaks for the American people. He needs to stand up to the Russians. I agree with Secretary Rice. I have great admiration for her. I worked for her. And I think she's right, that the Russians actually respect people who are strong.
Toughness,
Putin's an authoritarian thug. That's who Putin is. He doesn't respect people who talk nicely to him. He wants people, I think he respects people who defend their own interests, and I think that's the proper way for President Trump to handle this.
All right, we will leave it. We will leave it there. We'll be watching that, Ambassador. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
We'll check in to see if that subject is on the docket when the president meets with Lavrov. Ambassador Nicholas Burns joining us there.